Welcome back to Tales Arcane. Over the last week we've got a lot of new information about the 2024 Player's Handbook. I don't normally make videos about D&D related news, but there's some really interesting stuff to talk about here, so let's talk about it. In this video I'll cover some of the things we've recently learned about the new Player's Handbook, and I'll talk about whether or not I'll be rushing out to buy it. By the way, this video is made possible by the wonderful people who back me over on Patreon. When you back the Tales Arcane Patreon, you get access to more than 1,000 pages of my original homebrew content, including travel encounters, adventures, homebrew campaign settings, and a lot more. There's a link to the Patreon down below this video. The key context that you need here is that the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons has been out for 10 years, and the company behind the game, Wizards of the Coast, or WotC, are putting out a new set of core rulebooks. So, does that mean this is the 6th edition? No, not really. What's become quite clear is that this is a fine-tuning project. The 5e books have been out for a decade, and during that time, a lot of issues and weaknesses have gradually been revealed. These new core rulebooks appear to be designed to patch and resolve those weaknesses, either by introducing entirely new rules, or by incorporating some homebrew elements that the community have been running themselves to fix those problems. An emblematic example of that second approach is the incorporation of the popular homebrew rule that drinking a potion is a bonus action rather than an action. It was an action in the original 5e rules. With this new core rulebook set, it's going to be a bonus action. Essentially what we're getting is a remaster of 5th edition. It's like when a video game's been out for 10 years, the community have made a lot of mods and fixes, there's been some new DLC, and then the company behind it brings the best of all those elements together and puts out an official remaster. And that makes sense. 5th edition has been wildly popular, and WotC probably doesn't want to lose people by making too jarring a transition to a new rule set. But don't get me wrong, there are some new elements in this Player's Handbook that we're hearing about already, so let's talk about them. The 2024 Player's Handbook is going to be a big beast. I believe it's going to be bigger than any previous PHB in any previous edition of D&D, and that may partly be because a lot of material is being brought in from supplemental 5e books like Tasha's and Xanathar's and incorporated into the core rules. I think we can expect to see a lot of very familiar 5e feats, spells, and subclasses that were in those other books but are now being incorporated into one place. Speaking of subclasses, there are going to be at least 3 entirely new subclasses: the Path of the World Tree Barbarian, the College of Dance Bard, and the Circle of the Sea Druid. At the same time, quite a few of the original subclasses have been heavily tweaked and overhauled, some so much that they are apparently essentially new subclasses. These include the Beastmaster Ranger, the Archfey Warlock, and the Way of the Elements Monk, which was formerly the Way of the Four Elements Monk. Another part of the character creation process that should feel quite new is background selection. This is something that the WotC team are really kind of pushing to the forefront of their marketing for this, and apparently backgrounds are now going to have a much heavier impact on the shape of your character. In 5th edition, backgrounds were pretty half-baked, and from my experience, players by the midpoint of the campaign usually can't remember what background they started out with. With the new Player's Handbook, backgrounds should be a bit more impactful. For example, they should now have a mechanical influence on your ability scores. I believe that once you have a certain background, you can choose particular features that will give you either 3 points into one of your abilities, or 2 points into one and 1 point into another. When you select your background, that opens up a list of origin feats. These are feats specially balanced for lower level players, and you get one from level 1, much like a variant human or a Pathfinder player. And that seems to work. I think this is a good move. Again, adding a bit more impact and depth to your choice of background. As the game goes on, you'll be accessing your regular feats as normal, although I'm sure they've added in some new feats, but then at a higher level you get epic feats, and these are, or potentially epic boon feats, I need to double check that, but these are essentially feats that unlock, I think, at level 19, and they bring in sort of super powered heroic fantasy abilities that would be game breaking at lower levels, but should add to that sense of reaching kind of god tier power levels later on. Another thing that WotC are really highlighting at the moment is the inclusion of weapon mastery properties. Essentially, weapons all come with a special feature or perk that you can unlock with the weapons mastery feature, which you might get through your class or perhaps through a feat. And this is a special ability that you'll be able to use with that weapon to make it feel a bit more unique and impactful, and to show that you've got a higher skill level with that weapon than, say, some of the other players do. For example, if you have weapon mastery with a great axe, you can use its cleaving effect, hacking through multiple enemies with a single swing. Of course, this was an actual rule from some previous editions. It was also a variant rule in the 5e DMG, and I'm so happy to see this sort of thing being included. In 5e, weapons in general felt kind of dull and lifeless. It was really just a representation of a dice you could roll. So to have a little bit more of a specific thing you could do with your weapon is very fun. I also really like that this makes certain weapons particularly useful in certain situations. Now if you're dealing with a swarm of zombies pressed together as they come towards you down a narrow street, well, that player with the great axe wants to step up to the front and cleave through multiple of them at once. However, if you're fighting an enemy that's coming towards you and you want to maintain some distance with it, maybe if it's got a particularly damaging claw attack, well, you might use the heavy crossbow, which has a special property now where it can push the enemy back if you have that weapon mastery. A few other things that we can expect from the 2024 Player's Handbook include some basic crafting rules for making potions and magic items. These will be fleshed out in more detail apparently in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Stat blocks for creatures and monsters, especially those that the druid might be wild shaping into. Guides and information for creating and starting characters at higher levels. And a new kind of inspiration called Heroic Inspiration, which I believe allows you to re-roll any roll, saving throws, attacks, skill checks, and so on. That's pretty much everything that jumped out at me this week as I was going through the announcements, and I have to say, I'm really liking what I'm seeing. This feels like a really good evolution from where we were with 5e. The battle mastery stuff is very fun, could make martial stuff a lot more interesting, and it would take away that element where if you have two weapons and they're essentially the same hit die, then it doesn't really matter what weapon you're using. Now the specific property of that weapon could give you an edge in a particular context. That's really good. Love the idea of making backgrounds more impactful and important long term. Backgrounds were always a weak point, in my opinion, of 5e, and I'd love to see that corrected and made a more integral part of character creation. I'm also obviously just a big fan of bringing together material from the supplementary books. Now, instead of having to buy multiple books to get all the stuff that was in Xanathar's and Tasha's, some particularly good elements of that might have been ported over to the main core book. Again, that's a plus. As I say, this is not a new edition of D&D, but it does feel like a very good upgrade on what we had already. I think that when I play 5e in the future, it will be these updated 5e rules that I'll be using. I suspect my players are going to really enjoy it. It's going to be backwards compatible, I think, with most of my 5e adventures, and I'm really excited for this as a player and as a DM. Which brings us to an important question. The 2024 Player's Handbook is going to be about $50 or 40 British pounds. Same for the other core books, and that means to buy all three of the core books, the PHB, the DMG, and the Monster Manual, you're talking about $150 or £120, not including postage. With that in mind, I probably won't buy these books. I really like the look of them, but a lot of the core useful information they contain, all the updated rules, will soon be available on D&D Beyond, on Roll20, and on a variety of other third-party unofficial sites. To get access to this new version of D&D, you don't have to spend all this money. If I want to spend that kind of money, I'd probably spend it on some new books. For example, I don't have a copy of Pathfinder 2e. I've only ever got the rules for that online. So maybe I'd buy the core rulebook. That could be a lot of fun. I'd put money into the D20 Kickstarter or buy the D20 book when it comes out for a sale. Again, both of those systems do things like combat and character creation in ways that are far more dynamic and interesting to me as a DM and as a player than this new edition of 5e. I'm sure for many people these books will be wonderful additions to your collections, and I don't blame anyone for running out and getting these books, adding them to your shelves, and being inspired by these gorgeous new pieces of artwork. That's all fantastic. But for myself, if I have that money to drop, I just can think of so many things I'd rather spend it on than these slightly updated versions of the system I'm already familiar with. Thank you for watching, thank you for supporting the channel, thank you for backing me on Patreon if you've decided to hit the link down below the video. This was quite a rushed one. I just wanted to get it out there and talk about everything while it was still fresh in my mind. I'm sure we'll get a lot more details in the months ahead. There'll be all sorts of weird controversy that comes out because WotC always does something along the way. But if you're excited about these books, I would love to hear about it. Tell me below why you're excited. If you're buying them, tell me why you've decided to buy them. Even though I'm not getting them myself, I'm hyped about this, and I really like hearing from people who are genuinely excited about the hobby that we share. Anyway, I'll see you in the next video.